Good afternoon, Colombia, and good morning, Japan. We are on air now, and this is our third chapter, the third chapter of Conversations with World Philosophies. Today, our topic is Towards a Society with Nature. And that's that in general. So we are discussing today. We are discussing questions related to the possibilities of a harmonious relationship between human social needs and human needs in general, and the environment at large. Questions such as, is it possible to reconcile individual liberty and social solidarity? Or what are the social limits of individual liberties? Among other questions, how should we resignify empathy and solidarity in the middle of the current pandemic and physical distancing? Or how to overcome the human versus nature split? What is our moral relationship to ecosystems? Those questions and similar questions would be our topic today. So here, well, my name is Carlos Barbosa, and I am currently a professor at Universidad Pedagógica Nacional in Bogota. I am a specialist in Japanese philosophy, especially contemporary Japanese philosophy, more precisely Kyoto school philosophy. But I've been working on Dogen. I have a very vivid interest in Dogen and in the Huayan school, and the implications of Huayan thought and Dogen's thought for environmental philosophy and environmental issues in general. So I think I would approach the issue from that angle. Here we have our guests today are, first of all, Kyle Shuttleworth. He is a professor at Rikkyō University in Japan, and he's currently there. And recently, Kyle published a book. He published his dissertation as a book, and the book is entitled The History and Ethics of Authenticity, Meaning, Freedom, and Modernity. It was published by Bloomsbury this month, so congratulations on that. That great achievement. And yeah, so we hope we can read a bit about that soon. We'll see. So, well, and our second guest is Ana Rikkyō. She is part of our team here in Conversations with World Philosophies, and the director of the program of philosophy at Universidad del Bosque, also in Bogota. And she's been working with us for about 2 years. She's been reading and researching on Watsuji Tetsuro, the thought of Watsuji Tetsuro. So I guess she would approach the questions and the topic of this session from that angle. We'll see. So we can see that once more our focus is on Japanese philosophy. It does not mean that in Conversations with World Philosophies, we will always discuss Japanese philosophy. Eventually, we can explore other philosophical traditions in the years to come. The most important thing here is to discuss several great philosophical questions and several great issues of our time with several philosophical traditions in order to expand the borders of what we call philosophy. Well, our conviction is that we need a larger conception of philosophy than what we have in many universities today. What we have in many universities, it's not just Western philosophy taught as philosophy in general, but only a small part, a small chunk of the whole philosophical tradition in the West. So, of course, in itself, that's an important omission. At the same time, it is very rare to find classes on Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy, let alone Africana philosophy or American philosophy, I mean Native American philosophy, in barely any university worldwide. But I think it's time for a change, and a global world needs a broader conception of what philosophy is, not just philosophy conceived as something born in Greece. So we won't deny that philosophy was born in Greece. What we will contest is the idea that philosophy was only born in Greece. It was born in several places. It can be born in several places. And that is very important to accommodate philosophy into a global world. Make a conception of philosophy that really matches the challenges of a global world. That's it. So, well, I think that we can start then. So I would like to welcome again Professor Kyle Shuttleworth. You can start. So you have 20 minutes. And well, after each of us, so I will explain to the audience, of course, each of us will have 20 minutes. After that, well, Kyle will speak first, then Anna, and then I will speak. After those three presentations, we will have some discussion among ourselves. And after that, we will reply to comments and questions of the audience from YouTube. So if you are following this event from YouTube, even if it's from the English version, or if it's from the Spanish version, you can comment. If you want to comment in Spanish, feel free to do it, and then we will translate your comment here. If you comment in English, then we will project your question in English directly here. Well, once more, thank you very much, Kyle, for being here. The audience is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And thank you to Anne also for inviting me to this talk, and I'm very excited about it, and essentially the dissemination of sort of non-Western philosophy. So although Carlos previously mentioned that my doctoral research was on sort of the history and ethics of authenticity, at the same time, I was also working on a Japanese philosophy, in particular the philosophy of Watsuji Tetsuro, in terms of his ethical thought. But at Rikkyō, I've taken up a research position here to work on environmental ethics from a non-Western perspective. And so I'd like to talk about that today. And particularly, I'd like to talk about sort of the issue of anthropocentrism in relation to Watsuji Tetsuro's ethics. So I think we'll all agree that climate change is undoubtedly the most pressing ethical concern of our era. And although science or climatology can tell us sort of what is happening and why it's happening, it can't tell us what to do. It's moral philosophy which enables us to make sort of such judgments. However, in terms of environmental ethics, one of the issues at arriving at consensus and how to act concerns what it is that actually constitutes environmental ethics. So there are typically two approaches. The first is to apply existing ethical theories to the environment, and the second is to establish a new ethical theory. So in relation to the first then, it has been argued that attempts to extend existing ethical theories to environmental ethics have failed because they've been anthropocentric. So what I mean by anthropocentrism is that they've taken humans to be the measure of things. And this is a philosophical bias which has existed since at least Protagoras, who proclaimed sort of man to be the measure of things. So in terms of existing ethical theories then, so we see the likes of Peter Singer applying sort of utilitarianism to sort of environmental concerns, in particular in relation to animals. But for the likes of Singer, the grounds upon which we sort of judge something to be sort of ethical is in relation to whether it is a sentient being who derives pain or pleasure from that thing. But a further concern is that with this definition, we cannot then sort of apply this criteria to the environment itself. So how can we judge whether sort of trees, for example, derive pain or pleasure? And if we cannot do so, then does it seem that they don't have any, or we do not have any ethical obligations towards them? And again, we see in terms of sort of deontology, that Tom Regan, for example, has argued that we should respect animals with intrinsic value, so that they should have respectful treatment. But how do we define intrinsic value, and how do we determine what actually possesses this? So in terms of environmental ethics, then, we've seen that the initial sort of arguments against anthropocentrism go back to people like Aldo Leopold, who argued for a land ethic, and that in his theory, a thing is right when it preserves the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And whilst this may sound like a good idea, Leopold does not provide any sort of sound foundation in order to determine sort of exactly how to apply this theory. And a further criticism in the early stages of the development of environmental ethics was posed by Lynn White, who believed that Christianity to be the cause of anthropocentrism, insofar as we imagine that a man is created in the image of God and all other beings are further away from God, so that humans or man is at the top and everything else is in order belief, in a further sort of descending order. So from that, we take the belief that we have a right sort of to impinge upon nature, to use it as a resource to be plundered for riches and food, for example. So in contrast then to anthropocentrism, and the second possibility which I spoke about is something called ecocentrism. So for ecocentrists, rather than anthropocentric, which places man at the center, they believe that at the center should be sort of the environment itself. So it's not only sentient beings who should be attributed intrinsic value. So one of the main sort of proponents of this sort of new ecocentric theory was Arnes Nass, with their view of deep ecology. And this theory of deep ecology entails a respect for the intrinsic value and sacredness of the natural world. And Nass distinguishes their theory of sort of deep ecology from other ecocentric theories with these 8 principles. So these principles are sort of then has inherent value in terms of diversity, vital needs, population, human interference, policy change, and obligation of action. And although with deep ecology, they move away from this anthropocentric ethical view or standpoint, but nevertheless, they've still received criticisms. From Murray Bookchin, for example, says that the language used by sort of a deep ecology negatively represents humans as a pathological infestation. And there have been other criticisms that by talking about sort of deep ecology, that it's criticizing other sort of ecocentric theories as weak. And again, they've been criticized not only in terms of the language they use, Nass uses, but also in terms of misrepresenting scientific theories or misunderstanding them, perhaps. So I've pointed out then that there are 2 approaches at the moment to environmental ethics. So applying existing theories, which we've seen that typically, although they have been extended in terms of sort of deontology and utilitarianism, they typically apply their focus to animals and never really go beyond that. And again, we could argue that that's perhaps just an intrinsic feature of Western ethical theories, that they begin from sort of the standpoint of humans, and that's sort of the sole concern. And although they can kind of argue for like further sentient beings, such as sort of animals, that when it comes to sort of plant life or other parts of our environment which we feel are necessary to protect, there's no argument which can be, well, no satisfactory argument which can be provided to help us understand why or if we have any sort of obligations towards things other than sentient beings. And then again, with a lot of the ecocentric theories, although they have good intentions, the majority of people who in sort of ecology, they're not philosophers, and so they typically do not provide sort of rigorous sort of arguments or abstract theories which can be applied, but rather come up with nice ideas which we kind of hope that everyone would take to be common sense and wish to apply. But for philosophers, that's not satisfactory. And then again, we've seen that with deep ecology, for example, so there is a good rigorous attempt there, but nevertheless, we've seen that there are still several severe criticisms against it. So in my opinion, that the existing sort of ethical theories which have been developed are unsatisfactory for a philosopher in attempting to determine our obligations towards the environment or how we ought to approach the world from an ethical standpoint in order to preserve its integrity. So through my reading then of Watsuji, I initially began with his ethical thought, and with my doctoral research on the ethics of authenticity in Watsuji's thought, the translation of his Rinrigaku, or ethics, the word honraise is translated as authenticity. So that initially attracted my attention. I started looking at this and I discovered it's something very different to what we find in Western thought. And I kind of see a connection there, or a means of applying his ideas to the environment. And so Watsuji's famous for two main concepts, really. His ethics. In his ethics, he has this notion of aidagara, which has been translated as betweenness, or it's kind of human relationships. But I'll come to that in a second. And a further idea is that of thudo. And thudo is being translated as, the English translation, the title is Climate and Culture. And then there's also a French translation, which uses the term milieu, which is perhaps more appropriate for what Watsuji is attempting to define. So I'll begin with Watsuji's concept of thudo first. So thudo was developed in the eponymously titled book, which is published in 1935. And in this book, Watsuji ultimately illustrates that our environment is not separate from us. So it's not something we objectively experience, but something that we discover ourselves in. So he gives the example of the cold, and when we feel the cold, we do not encounter an objective cold, something which is apart from us, but rather we find ourselves in the cold. So he also just suggests that this is not a subjective experience. It's not something that sort of like I may feel the cold and somebody else doesn't experience it. But rather, he says that so humans in the same place will experience the same cold at the same time. And it's this mutual experience which allows us to express to another person that, for example, it's a bitterly cold day. And thudo is also a historical concept insofar it has led to regional traditions of architecture, clothing, and food. So that is, so in Japan, for example, you can see that traditionally wooden structures were built to withstand humid summers and ice-cold winters in terms of clothing. In the hot summers, people traditionally wore thin cotton yukata. And sort of in the winter and colder seasons, they wear a kimono of like several thick layers. And then in terms of food, so it's not that Japanese people just decided, oh, like rice, that's a great thing, we'll use that as a staple diet. But rather, rice flourished in sort of the climate in Japan due to sort of the heavy rain and the oppressive heat. So in this way, Watsuji presents an alternative way of thinking about our environment as a fundamental part of who we are. That is something essential which shapes us rather than something objective to be shaped by us. So we see Watsuji here attempting to rethink our relationship to the world. So we're kind of seeing a movement away from an anthropocentric worldview, in that it's not that we see humans as sort of like outstanding or sort of existing entirely in abstract from the world. It's not a subject-object relationship, but rather it's an interdependent one, where who we are is in part determined, or not determined, sorry, is understood in relation to our fudo, or our climate, or culture, or milieu. However, so the way to rethinking ethics, environmental ethics, is suggested that the two existing approaches are unsatisfactory, can actually be derived, in my thought, from Watsuji's ethical thought. So in his book, Ethics, or Rinrigaku, which is published in 1937, Watsuji argues against subjective ethics, which he sees as representative of sort of Western philosophy at the time, which takes a standpoint of individual consciousness alone. So Watsuji, he begins with an almost linguistic deconstruction on the word of ethics itself. And interestingly, so in chapter 11 of Watsuji's autobiography, he talks about how in Ichiko, Tokyo First Higher School, which is a preparatory school for Tokyo University, he was taught by Nitobe Inazo, who you famously know as has written the book Bushido, The Soul of Japan. And Watsuji recounts that Nitobe would teach ethics lessons, and one such ethic lesson, Nitobe sort of went about providing this linguistic sort of deconstruction, and it's kind of like a play on words upon using the Japanese characters and breaking them down from the word and showing how the individual components mean something greater than sort of the word itself. And we see Watsuji do a lot of this in his ethical thought. So in Rinrigaku then, so he takes the Japanese word for ethics, which is rinri, and rinri is composed of two characters. The first, rin, means something like a compassionate association. But what's interesting about this word is that Watsuji shows that rin is both a relational group between individuals and those individuals themselves. So he uses the example of a drawing from Confucianism and these 5 bonds. So he uses one of a father and son. So he illustrates that in terms of this relationship between a father and son, the father and the son do not exist independently of one another as father and son. So it's not that there was a father and then there was a son and then they came together to form this relationship, but rather they exist in virtue of sort of this relationship. So this kind of explains his concept of rin. So it's a relational structure. So it's, for example, the father and son relationship, but it also contains those two individuals, the father and the son, rather than having two subjects in an intersubjective relationship. It is a more encompassing relationship. And within these relationships, there's also an ethical particular pattern of ethical behavior. So that, particularly in Confucianism, the son has duties towards the father and the father has duties towards the son, namely the son to be like dutiful and filial, and for the father to protect their son, give them a good moral upbringing, and to ensure that they're able to flourish as an individual. So the second character then of the word rinri, ri, means like reason, and Watsuji says it, or emphasizes that it's used to explain the order and the way which causes the communal existence of humans to be what it is. So in this regard then, Watsuji claims that ethics, from this linguistic deconstruction of the word rinri, refers to the laws of social existence, namely those relations of how we interact with other people in terms of that relational structure within which we find ourselves. So in order to further express this, Watsuji turns to the word for human itself, ningen. So again, ningen is also composed of two characters. The first, nin, which means person, and the second, gen, means like a space. In particular, it focuses on the second character, space, and this implies an in-betweenness, or in terms of aidagata, between person and person. So these two characters of person and space, for Watsuji, suggests that to be human is to understand the space between people, or between others, that there's an inherent relationship in what it is to be human. So we can think in terms of Aristotle's political animal kind of concept. For Watsuji, we're very much sort of communal animals. So what Watsuji is really developing here with his theory of rinri, or ethics, and ningen, or human, is that he wants to show that to be human is a non-binary concept which simultaneously expresses both the parts and the whole. So again, when we think about those, because what it is to be human is to exist with other people, and how we interact with other people is what is ethical within a particular relational structure. So whenever we always find ourselves within a particular relational structure, and when we do so, there are certain laws or rules expected of how we ought to act and treat other people. And again, so it's both this relational structure and sort of the constituent parts, the individuals. So this is something we see a later postmodern theorists taking up, especially when you think of Derrida looking for this difference, that there are things which can't just be defined in one way. And we see Watsuji doing something similar like a long time before. So what I've defined thus far, it seems that Watsuji's providing a kind of an interrelational theory, but he goes beyond this position by stating that it's neither an individual nor a communal position. So in his account then, an individual approach is problematic because it negates any sense of community. So when you focus exclusively on the individual, you lose sense of sort of the outside world. And again, we can see this is a criticism of sort of existential philosophers. So with Sartre, for example, when he develops his notion of a radical freedom, so though he's kind of pointing out, he's right in the sense that, well, there seems to be no ethical theory within which to adhere to, so then why aren't our choices all free? But we later got these criticisms that, well, this is just like a narcissistic ethic where you can do whatever you want and then justify it yourself, because if everything is your own choice, if you have this radical freedom, then there seems to be no objective standpoint from which to judge or determine whether an action is right or wrong or ethical or not. And again, this is something like Charles Taylor takes up. So we have Sartre's famous example of the student. So Sartre suggests that, gives the example of the student who approaches him and says, I'm at this ethical crossroads. So my father kind of went off and And my brothers went off to join the French resistance to fight against the Germans, and sort of both of them have died, and like my father has abandoned my mother as well. So it's only myself, and my mother really depends upon me and needs me. But I also want to do my part for my country. Like, I want to join the resistance and fight against the Germans. So he asked Sartre, like, what should I do? And Sartre ultimately tells him, like only you know. There's no ethic which exists which enables, provides like a firm decision on what you should do. So Charles Taylor criticized Sartre that if radical freedom is true, then it's not an unethical concern at all, because whatever the student chooses is the right choice. And so he doesn't really have this concern about whether he has a duty towards his mother at all. So you can see Watsuji kind of rejecting this concern about an individual who exists in abstract of their community or any other objective ground. But likewise, he also rejects a communal approach, as we find in Confucianism, for example. So he would say that with this communal approach, then, it ultimately negates any sense of individuality. And so we lose a sense of like who we are as individuals and our own sense of personal development. And again, we end up with what Heidegger would sort of criticize as kind of Das Man, or Nietzsche would refer to as like a herd mentality, just doing what we're told to do. So what Watsuji then suggests is this double negation. As it says, we neither accept like an individual approach nor a communal approach, but rather we negate both. And what this brings us to then is what he refers to as this home ground of existence. So although thus far we may think that, well, okay, suggested that we want to overcome anthropocentrism, and it seems that all what Watsuji's really done with his ethics is kind of moved away from a subjective standpoint. But through his notion of authenticity, or honraise, so Watsuji says that it's the realization of this that we're led to this standpoint where, so he expresses the Zen koan, what was your true face prior to the birth of your parents? And again, with koans, a koan, so they're notoriously sort of difficult and paradoxical, and it's something to contemplate upon. But what I think Watsuji is attempting to express here is that through this notion of honraise, or the achievement of this, is to realize that the home ground of existence is a plane where we exist, where we're neither individual nor communal, but the double negation of this leads us to realize that we're also part of the wider world. And again, we see an expression of this in the likes of other Kyoto school thinkers like Nishitani Keiji, for example, who talks about sort of to understand sort of the pine trees, like, or the bamboo, to become the pine trees of the bamboo. And it's this contemplation and this standpoint of realizing that we're more than individuals, we're more than our community, we're part of sort of the wider environment. So it's in this regard that I believe Watsuji can provide the means to overcome sort of problems associated with early articulations of environmental ethics, namely, so that he's not come from a Christian culture, but rather his notion of honraise is grounded upon sort of the Buddhist ontology of nothingness. So to arrive at this home ground, to achieve authenticity for Watsuji, is to arrive at the realization of nothing, as opposed to being, as found in Western thought. And so he goes as far as sort of challenging existing ethical theories. We've seen that it's not only the Western tradition, as taking a subjective approach in ethics, but also existing Eastern ethical theories such as Confucianism. And again, of course, it's founded on Buddhist metaphysics, so it kind of goes away from the criticisms of Lynn White that due to Christianity, that this notion of anthropocentrism is inherent within Western culture. So whilst Watsuji's ethical theory can help us overcome this problem of anthropocentrism, so it does not lead to a direct resolution of the environmental crisis. So what it does provide us with is the means to clear aside an impediment which prevents philosophers from actually doing environmental ethics. So suggested at the beginning of the talk, that this notion of anthropocentrism provides a real obstacle to resolving actual problems. And I believe that from reconsidering ethics from a Watsujian standpoint, that it provides us with a means to seriously evaluate our ethical duties towards the environment. So thank you for listening to that.
Thank you very much, Kyle. So, well, there are several questions, surely, that, well, I already come up to my mind now after this. But, well, of course, we will have time for that. Once again, thank you very much. It was a very, very good for us to have a sufficiently broad presentation of the issue today. So, well, I'm going to invite now Professor Ana Rikō. Ana, now the floor is yours. And once you finish, then I will be back here. I will talk for a few minutes, and then we will join again on the main screen for discussion. Okay. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation and for having me here. It's an honor and a joy to talk with Kyle and Carlos. I wrote a short text that I'm going to read. It's not easy for me. I am not used to express myself in English, so I thought it would be better if I read my presentation. I would like to begin with the last question posed for our dialogue. Environmental ethics, how to overcome the human versus nature split. What is our moral relationship to ecosystems? Because I feel that if we take in consideration some aspects of environmental ethics, specifically Watsuji's environmental ethics, this can help us to understand properly how we should rethink our relationship to ecosystems and the way we interact with others, and also how to reconcile individual liberty and social solidarity. But why should we do this? Why we must try it? It seems very obvious. Our survival as a species and the life we want to live are at stake. And we don't do collective actions, we are endangering and even condemning the whole planet, not only ourselves. This, of course, would be an irreparable loss and a major moral fault. The problem is then of vital and moral urgency. One perspective we might place ourselves in order to understand this loss and explain why we must refrain from damage is to assume that there is intrinsic value in entities existing around us, and in consequence, we have moral limits and duties regarding them. This point of view rests on two assumptions. First, the value of entities lies in themselves and not in the relations between them. Second, human beings are not directly related to the entities that are part of ecosystems. Not all variants of environmental ethics subscribe to the first assumption, but I assume to accept so far that a holistic view that puts into question is not the predominant point of view. The second assumption has the same flaw. Human beings are not seen as natural beings intimately related to all other natural beings, and nature is viewed as non-human or humans are viewed as non-natural. Other perspectives within environmental ethics try to amend these mistakes. I will go back to this soon. Despite the problematic assumptions, there are important questions which arise in this model. What kind of moral duties do we have with others, including living and sentient beings like animals and plants and with nature as a whole? Are there some limits in the way we assume these moral duties, and which are these limits? One of the central debates in environmental ethics in the past century has been focused on the problem, how to avoid the idea that human beings are not part of the natural world. This idea may originate in a questionable pretense of, so to say, elevating ourselves from the natural world and placing ourselves above of it. This sublimation of our place in relation to the world and the consequent separation from it support the dualism human versus natural world. From this point of view and this attitude, when we try to think over nature, to think over human beings and their relation to nature, is taken for granted that we should trace boundaries between them. In this frame, to preserve the environment demands to stop human development, to decelerate as much as possible. A separation that now becomes opposition justifies oppressive hierarchies and the relation with the natural world. Even from a pseudo-ecological perspective, is conceived as a transaction and a power relationship. We have good reasons and evidence to reject an individualistic and divided perspective. But what exactly means to be part of the environment? It is not only to recognize that the way we live affects the environment in crucial ways. This recognition may still be based on a dualistic perspective, which explains this kind of phenomena as transactions. It is very important to go back to the essential question. What is to be related with the environment? In Watsuji Tetsuro's philosophy, the fundamental fact that defines us is that the environment is the way we inhabit the world, the way in which we are in the world. Environment is not only the natural world. We are not merely related to it, since we are essentially determined by environment, not merely naturally, but also cultural, historical, and social ways. Environment is what we are. According to these perspectives, environment is an ontological condition that defines our corporality and subjectivity. Watsuji, in his work Fudo, Climate and Nature, defends that not only time is a condition of human experience. Space is equally important. Space is not just the physical space, but inhabited space. Space is also climate, is defined also by topographic and geological features, is the living and sentient beings around us. Space is culture, history, society, economics, politics, art and design, literature, etc. We must be careful here. Space is not just adding things or similar in some sense, related to natural world topics. I am going to rephrase one of Watsuji's examples in Fudo. Kyle mentioned it. When we feel cold, it's not only that our bodily temperature decreases. We feel ourselves being one with the cold. Feeling cold is also to modify our clothes, to design house to preserve us. Feeling cold is to appreciate, even fear in some circumstances, the force of natural elements as water or wind. Feeling cold can be as well breathtaking, being in astonishment. Feeling cold as to the food we eat, the literature and poetry we write about it, the major and minor events in our life shaped by it. This kind of recollection is a phenomenological reflection. Its purpose is allow to us to be conscious that space is a subjective spatiality, a way to understand ourselves in the natural world. And it's at the same time acceptation of the intimate and sacred character of nature, and of our being one with her. There is not such a thing like human world versus natural world, because nature, from our experience, shows us that we are one with her. This subjectivity is actually intersubjectivity, since we are always in the middle of connections, relations with others. The main concept for Watsuji here is aidakara, betweenness. That is the real human nature, to be connected with others and aiming them in the world. Mochizuki Kitaro holds in Climate and Ethics ethical implication of Watsuji Tetsuro's concepts climate and climaticity, that the expansion and change of the original space concept in Watsuji's work is an invitation to appreciate the fundamental human condition in a wider perspective. There is no humanity or human being without the environment. Inotsuka-yu also stresses this in Watsuji's work. To re-examine our concept of environment is at the same time to re-examine our concept of humanity. If we accept the phenomenological term, it is clear how this holistic conception or environment is a new starting and promising point to recognize and restore an adequate perspective for the environmental studies, including environmental ethics. Watsuji invites us to develop a phenomenological examination of climate in order to discover that. First, no human group can be fully understood unless we recognize first the influence of environment. Second, environment is never opposed to or strange to us. It's a constitutive part of us. Third, we are ecological beings and we must live in harmony with the acknowledgement of this condition. Therefore, our ways of life should show a strong ecological commitment. Since it is an ontological category, it is evident for Watsuji that the space for human beings is to be embedded in the natural world, being related and connected with other. There is no such a thing like an I isolated or an I superior to others. This characteristic is developed in Hisetti's Rinriraku. Betweenness in Fudo is related to natural world as otherness, that is to an extended I. In Rinriraku, Watsuji broadens this otherness, including the social dimension. There is no I unless us and our exists. Quoting Watsuji. Ethics is a way or the manner or the interconnection of us that makes ningen, person, truly ningen, person. That is, it is a manner of sonsai, social being, of ningen. Hence, the science of ethics is the study of ningen, person, regarded as ningen sonsai, person as social being. By virtue of the fact that this study proves into the practical basis of being and the consciousness of the odd, and so forth, it claims a basic status over against the study of being and the study concerning the consciousness of the odd to be. Through the basic clarification of ningen sonsai, the problems on how objective beings arise or how consciousness of the ought to be arises in each it can be resolved. Therefore, prior to questions concerning all sorts of natural beings and idealistic oughts, the clarification of the basic ground must be carried out on the level of subjective and practical sonsai. This is from Rinriraku, the beginning of the Rinriraku. This leads us to our second question. How should we resignify empathy and solidarity in the midst of the current pandemic and physical distancing? I would like to emphasize that according to the World Health Organization, the different approaches to the current pandemic are focused on the vaccine. But we are not taking seriously how to think over the relationship we have with nature that has led us to this dreadful situation. Vaccines are really important, of course. However, it is also mandatory to see the full picture. The way we are living is leading us to an ecocide. Real empathy and meaningful solidarity demand to recognize and act in accordance with the ontological principle of interconnection between all beings. Without this, we are still in a dualistic frame, which promotes egotistical worldviews and behaviors and objectification of all sentient living things and resources. In Western thought, for example, it wasn't easy before the 20th century to identify a dominant thought that values adequately the natural world. I would like to mention Walking by Henry David Thoreau, a text written in 1862. Now, it is an esteemed work because it is seen as a pioneer text reminding ourselves that we are natural beings. But most importantly, it is proposing us a new way of life, coming back to the nature. Although Thoreau mentions that we have a wild side in his text, the dichotomy between nature and human being is presented as a problematic feature of the human essence. Civilization is opposed to wildness. Now we are in circumstances that require us asking if civilization is about to ruin an ecosystem that is an extended part of us. Thoreau stresses in his work the healing and restorative power of contemplation of the inherent beauty of nature. This aesthetic value is too a remarkable and central one in Fudo, and it is an important trait in different environmental ethics defending nature's aesthetic value. I see in Watsuji's environmental philosophy an invitation to live in a different way. We are related to others, embedded in the world. We have so many possibilities to be diverse and lively. About the last question, it is possible to reconcile individual liberty and social solidarity, and what are the social limits of individual liberties? I would like to point briefly that this question confronts us with the opposition we assume is a predominant trait of our current ways of life, but maybe it's possible to understand it from another perspective. An egotistical attitude is the hallmark of our era. We tend to assume that every action that demands certain symmetry is a negative limitation of individual liberty. The menace for our liberty maybe comes from narrow but powerful structures. Sophocles, in his tragedy Antigone, wrote that nothing is more denotatus, formidable, fearsome, and terrible than human being. Sophocles is telling us no matter how clever, ingenious humans are, it is impossible to elude death. We had forgotten this. Thank you. I think now is Carlos' time to present us.
Well, I'm very sorry. My apologies. We had a little problem with electricity here. Actually, it was way worse last night. Fortunately, it was only a few seconds now. So, well, thank you, Anna, very much for that presentation. So, again, we have a broad perspective. That's an interesting thing to see, and a nice thing to see that we have a broad perspective to discuss our topic today. I would like to mention Professor Rebecca Maldonado is here now. She is a professor at UNAM, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and a great advocate for Japanese philosophy in the Spanish-speaking world. So we are proud that you are here with us. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Well, so now I would like to approach the issue from a different angle, theoretically, but I think that there would be a lot in common with what was discussed by Kyle and Anna before. One of the reasons is that I would like to approach the matter from Huayan philosophy and from Dogen. Especially, I would like to focus on the way that Dogen materializes Huayan logic in his own thought. Huayan, by the way, was a school, a Buddhist school in Tang Dynasty's China from the 6th to the 8th centuries, more or less. And Dogen was active in the 13th century in Japan. And so the thing is that Dogen is one of the philosophical bases for Watsuji's philosophy. Actually, Watsuji was very important for the spread of Dogen's thought as philosophy in 20th century Japan. I think he was the first person to write a full book-length philosophical commentary on Dogen's philosophy in the modern age, at least. So, well, I would like to mention something about Huayan thought and why I consider it important here. It's a very complex issue, by the way, but It has to do with the way that they conceptualize Buddhist interdependence, the notion of of a dependent arising, or yes, dependent arising or dependent co-arising. We can also say interdependence. To put it, I mean, long story short, the way that they conceptualize this notion is what they call non-interference. And it is put in terms of what we could call principle. Well, actually, the word in classical Chinese is li, or in Japanese ri, which has the nuance of principle, ratio, proportion, and it could be, I would say, close to our word for reason, to our words for reason in European languages. But I think we could translate it here as principle. So non-interference has to do with the relation between the principle. The principle for Huayan thought is the principle of emptiness, or the fundamental non-form of the universe. The fact that the universe, or reality as a whole, has no definite form of itself, and at the same time that each individual thing does not have a known nature or a proper nature, a nature that belongs to that thing in itself, in and of itself, but rather all things exist independence of conditions. And that means that each thing exists in independence of other things. So the way that Huayan conceptualizes this is in terms of this relation between principle and things, and non-interference. So it can be summarized, but the thing is very complex, but it can be summarized into principles. One is non-interference between principle and things. It means that principle, the principle of emptiness, the fundamental non-form of things, permeates the whole universe without exception. Without an exception at all. No thing is exempt from this emptiness, this lack of own nature. However, by this same principle, each thing can be what it is. So for example, if we have this little eraser here, we have an eraser here, and we call it a razor. So by the principle of emptiness, we say, actually, this is not an eraser in and of itself. It is an eraser because it has a certain shape, because the atmosphere of the earth allows it to preserve its own shape, because we use it as an eraser. However, by that same fundamental emptiness of things, of the universe, this eraser can be an eraser precisely because it is dependent on other things as conditions. So that's the first thing, non-interference of principle and things. The second part of this notion is the non-interference between thing and thing. And this means that, well, thing, as I mentioned, exists in interrelation. So for example, this eraser and I right now exist in independence of each other. Thanks to this eraser, I can develop my ideas. I can correct certain ideas. I can erase ideas that would put shame on my name, for example, if I consider it so. Or they could erase things that I shouldn't have erased, and that would have an influence in my life, however small or big, however big or small, I mean. So in that sense, this eraser and me, we are linked by a relation of interdependence. Just as an example. But the interesting point here is that the fact that we are linked, we are fundamentally linked, the eraser and I, does not hinder my own existence, my own being. And I am not hindering the being of this eraser. Actually, because of that interrelation, the eraser can be the eraser, and I can be what I am. This, well, implies at the same time that I am not, I mean, there is no way to differentiate between an essence or a core essence that I have, an essence that makes what I am as myself, and the contingency of my changes. Actually, what I am is totally what I am. What is happening to myself, what is happening in myself right now, that is what I am, without a possibility of making a clear-cut distinction between essence on the one hand and appearance on the other hand. The way that this can be illustrated, there are several ways this can be illustrated. One of them is an image that comes from India, and the name, well, reveals that precisely. That image is called the Indra's net, or the net of Indra. For this image, I mean, imagine that there is a big fishing net, right? And well, if you have a net like that, a fishing net, and then the net is made of knots, of course. The knots are part of the net. And I say, I can pick up one of those knots. But if I pick one of the knots, I am picking the whole net. Then I could say, this is an interesting thing, but I want to analyze and see just a single knot so I can inspect it. And I can analyze it, of course, with my discriminative thought. But what if I think this is not enough? Because I try to pick just a knot of the net, and I'm picking the whole net. But I want to have only this knot. So what I do is cut it. What if I cut it? I don't have the knot. If I try to cut the knot from the net, I am actually destroying the knot, but the net is still there. So at the same time, I can analyze a thing. For example, I can analyze a certain society, and I can, with my discriminative thought, I can analyze it and describe it and understand a lot of that society. But if I try to split it from the rest of reality and isolate it from the rest of reality, I do not obtain the thing. Because precisely that society exists not against the influence of other factors, but precisely because of those factors. And to link that with Watsuji's thought, precisely one of those factors, now that we have the example of a certain society does not exist like against nature or against the environment or split from the environment, but precisely because of the environment, because of the territory where that society inhabits. Now, what I would like to point out is the way that this principle is manifest in Dogen's thought. And I think I would like to quote here two places where Dogen he manifests this interdependence in several places. But I think two places are interesting here because of the way that this notion of interdependence and non-interference materializes in very concrete life situations, especially in cooking, in something that could appear to the philosophical tradition here as a very unphilosophical thing. But for Dogen, we could say, from Dogen's viewpoint at least, we could consider that actually in a situation apparently as lacking any depth as cooking, in a situation like that, in a place that wouldn't seem a place for philosophy as the kitchen, actually we have a very good examples of this principle of interdependence and non-interference. So there are two places where this is very clear in Dogen. One of them is called Mealtime Regulations, in Japanese Fukushu Hampo. This is the place where Dogen instructs his disciples about how to eat, how to behave in the dining room. So I would like to mention one quote from the Fukushu Hampo, or Mealtime Regulations. There he says, if the whole universe is the dharma, the law, the principle, or the teaching as well, if the whole principle is the dharma, then food is also the dharma. Food, if the whole universe is the principle, then food is also the principle. If the universe is truth, then food is truth. If one is illusion, then the other is illusion. And further ahead, he says, when we eat, the universe is the whole truth in its appearance. Nature, substance, force, activity, cause, effect, relatedness, consequence, and individuality. The truth manifests itself when we eat. When eating, we can realize the manifestation of truth. Interestingly, Dogen does not simply say, okay, when you go to the dining room, just behave this way or behave this way. Do not do this, do not do that. Well, of course he does that in the Fukushu Hampo, in this instructional chapter, but he first comments on the Dharma and he comments on reality. And from that viewpoint, he justifies his instructions for the dining room. And so the principle here, as we see, is that in every chunk of food, the universe manifests itself. And this means, from a Buddhist perspective, that in each chunk of food, the Dharma, the teaching, the whole of the principle of reality manifests itself. So the attitude for the monk in the dining room must reflect respect for that chunk of food, because that chunk of food, as it manifests the principle of reality, just in one single chunk of food, that means that if we treat that chunk of food with whole respect and reverence, without discarding it because it feels that it's ugly to us, or without clinging to it because we consider that it is too tasty, but with full respect, then that chunk of food manifests the truth of the universe. And that happens in a similar way in another of Dogen's writings. Actually, these two writings belong to the pure standards for the Zen community. The pure standards for the Zen community, well, they have the intention precisely to set the rules for these activities of the monks in Dogen's community. And it's become, of course, the instruction for the whole school based on Dogen's teachings, the Soto Zen sect. The second chapter that I would like to mention is the Tenzo Kyokun, which could be translated as Instructions to the Chief Cook. So interestingly, in this work, in a similar way to what we have seen so far, Dogen does not limit itself to instructing the cook how to cook. He starts saying that the cook should not simply be good at cooking. Actually, that's not the primary thing. For him, the cook, the one who plays the role of the cook in the monastic community, has to be an expression of compassion, of loving compassion to humanity. In that respect, it needs to be a person no novice can be appointed as the monastery's cook. Why? That is what he is going to explain. So I would like to quote this one of a passage of this work here. He says, I quote, "When rice and vegetables are being examined and washed, it is imperative that the cook be both single-minded yet practical, ensuring that the work is done to the very best of his ability and without allowing contempt for any foodstuff to arise in his mind. He must be diligent in all his work without discriminating against one thing as opposed to another." So the first thing that Dogen says here is that in the act of cooking, you manifest the spirit of non-discrimination. From a Buddhist perspective, or at least from a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, there is ultimately those differences between good or bad, just and unjust, tasty or untasty, are based on the discriminating mind. And even though the discriminating mind helps us, to find our way about in the world, and it even helps us to understand the teaching, in the long run, we need to go beyond that discrimination. Why? Precisely because things do not exist separately. Things exist in terms of conditions. So that's the first thing he mentions here, that it's not simply a philosophically abstract teaching, but it should be manifest in daily activities such as cleaning, such as walking, even sleeping, and of course, in this case, in the activity of cooking. The second passage that I would like to mention from the Tenzo Kyokun goes like this, I quote, "It was once said by a great teacher that priests do not differentiate between various foods, just as a fire does not differentiate between various sorts of firewood. If we are sincere when cooking, even the coarsest food can help us to exhibit the seed of Buddhahood. Never underestimate these things. Never make light of such things." End quote. Here, I think it is clear how Dogen manifests what we saw before. The cook does not underestimate any of the ingredients. He should not be, or she should not be, of the attitude of saying, okay, this ingredient is good, so we are going to use it. But this ingredient is bad. It's coarse food. It's a bad quality product. So we are going to discard it, or we are going to give it to someone else. No, the cook should learn to prepare the best meal possible with the ingredients that they have. This manifests the attitude of non-discrimination, and at the same time manifests the attitude of respecting even every grain of rice. And he mentions that in the Tenzo Kyokun. You should not underestimate even the smallest grain of rice, because even the smallest grain of rice that you have manifests as the truth of the universe. If you discern it well, if you treat it beyond discrimination, beyond tasty and untasty. I think the interesting thing here from an ecological standpoint is that both in the instructions for the dining room and the instructions for the cook, Dogen is manifesting an attitude that reverses consumerism in our times. Consumerism is based on this notion. We start from our own desires. We have certain desires, and then we ask ourselves, how can I fulfill my desires? How can I fulfill what I need or my interests? We can have a great justification for those desires. For example, it might be something as futile as I want ice cream. I want an ice cream. Or it can be something as relevant for us as I want justice in the world, or I want social justice, or I want an improvement in economic conditions. That can be our wish. But then if we start from our wish, and then we start saying, like, asking ourselves, like, okay, how can we make this a reality? Then this is what triggers the ecological crisis, precisely that mindset. Because then we treat nature as resources, merely as resources. And then we exploit them in terms of our objectives. And we do not consider if we would put ecosystems out of balance. Interestingly, this awareness of consuming without disrupting the balance of the environment has been present in several peoples around the world, which many would consider primitive. But it seems that they have done a better job at preserving, at maintaining a relationship to the environment that does not destroy the environment. And that way they will not be destroyed in the long run. It happens, for example, in the Amazon basin in South America. And several North American people seem to be a good example of this as well. And I think that that in basic terms, this principle is manifest here also in Dogen. So if we use this logic of, okay, so we have to set our objectives and then we decide how we are going to fulfill them. That way, in the long run, is destined to fail. And it seems that we are not the only example in history. But what if we reverse this logic? What if we base our thinking in relation to the environment in terms of respecting the trees, valleys, and rivers, and the food that we eat, because those things manifest the truth of the universe. Based on that, our logic would not be, these are our objectives, now how do we fulfill them? No, our logic is, first we start from the environment itself, and then from the environment we ask ourselves, what can we do in the best way possible given these circumstances, given these environmental restrictions or these environmental conditions that we have? And I would call them, actually, it would be better to call them conditions and not restrictions. Because if we call them restrictions, we call them that way in terms, in terms of separating ourselves from the rest of nature. But if we realize that it's not just that, that's a possible perspective. But we can also see those things from the perspective that those things that we call restrictions, lack of resources, we say, are actually the conditions that make our existence possible, and even our existence possible as a society, as Watsuji correctly points out. So if we move on that direction, so we are not conceiving then of nature, of rivers and stones and mountains and valleys only as resources, or merely as resources that are, apart from ourselves, but they are as conditions for our own existence. We belong to that network. The whole of reality is a network. Remember the IndraSnet image. If we conceive of ourselves in those terms and in terms of non-interference, then we do not behave like consumers, mere consumers, but we behave as we tend then to think in terms of our responsibility to sustain that equilibrium. We then more easily understand that we cannot just take a certain amount of wood, for example, because that's what we want to do. But we first ask ourselves, well, how much wood can we take without disturbing the environment, without disturbing ecosystems? Well, that's my suggestion. By now, I think, well, it's of course there is much more to clarify, but then I think it's time to move to discussion. So I would like to invite Kyle and Anna. And meanwhile, I would like to mention then a first thing to discuss, because of course, now trying to tie the knots, now that we were talking about knots, that's a good image probably. Well, starting from what I've just said, it still seems that probably it's still one thing to talk about the relation between society and the environment, and another thing to talk about how society can settle how society can develop and thrive in harmony with the environment. So the thing is, well, and I would like to from Watsuji, I would like to ask first, well, what do you think? Because what we saw, what we heard recently was from a logic like Watsuji's, we can overcome, I mean, certain difficulties that hinders environmental ethics. But now one of Watsuji's main topics was society. So one of the questions I think that we could ask Watsuji is, well, how is it possible that society, well, we don't need to go too concretely, but how is it possible that society lives in a more responsible way, environmentally speaking? So, well, if Kyle wants to talk first, so.
Okay, yeah. Just what both Anna and myself spoke about was in Rinrigaku each, the first volume of Watsuji's Ethics. In the second volume, he develops his theory of society, or this theory of Aidugara, in a much more concrete form, namely society. So here he talks about different relationships. He says the most basic relationship that we have is between two people. So that's sort of the first ethical organization or ethical relationship. So he says that kind of develops and becomes sort of widens out when we get to the notion of the family. Because you kind of see like these changes where, so in a relationship between two people, and of course Watsuji, sort of writing in the 1930s, was thinking about sort of a man and a woman. So he says their relationship is ultimately of a sexual nature, and that's their connection. So he thinks about them, they develop when they're, for these concepts or these virtues of trust and truthfulness, or makoto, or sincerity, may be more appropriately translated as. And so whenever trust is established between sort of the husband and wife, their relationship flourishes. So that's when an ethical standard is maintained and developed. So then whenever the couple procreate and have children, the relationship is no longer purely sexual, but then it's mediated through this shared connection of the child. So then the parents have, reciprocally, both the parents and the children have ethical obligations towards one another. So he keeps showing how this expands further. So from sort of the two people to the family to the community, and at the level of the community, the virtues are, rather than just thinking about your own family and its flourishing, thinking about contributing to the community, being sort of a part of that, and seeing your community flourishing as well. And then we kind of see, so it goes up several stages to the state. So then he says that the notion of sort of developing sort of the state as a nation. So, and I kind of think, so I noticed there's a question or comment by Professor Professor Rebecca Maldonado, who said about, she liked this idea how my theory ceases to be a dialectic. And this thinking about that, and sort of one criticism of Watsuji is that the second volume of Rinrigaku was published in 1943 at the height of the Pacific War. So he was sort of criticized for some nationalism and sort of justifying sort of the Japanese Empire's sort of occupation of other territories. But if that's sort of the dialectic, and if we sort of extend it further, so if it goes towards sort of this notion of the earth, so we can think that it's not that we stop at just a nation, but each nation kind of has their own obligations within their citizens to sort of implement, perhaps like laws and regulations to ensure that we do take care of our society, that like we don't pollute and we move away from or crack down on sort of capitalist sort of ideas that profit is the most important, whereas we think that rather than letting sort of factories like pollute rivers because they're paying off someone, and sort of the community or society as a whole sort of takes that more seriously, then in that respect, we could extend Watsuji's theory to show that we can have ethical obligations towards the earth in terms of these relationships we have, sort of moving from individuals to sort of family to community to state to the earth as a whole. And I think that's kind of a good sort of foundation for me for extending sort of Watsuji's thought to the environment as a whole, and again, a way of like practically implementing his ideas.
Yes, well, I was probably had in mind especially Fudo, this climate, because, well, I'm not sure if Watsuji develops his thought in that direction, but yeah, it suggests at least that it seems that by the very principle that we have responsibilities toward others in our human society, I mean, essentially that's the same principle that bases our responsibilities even to inert things, what we would call inert things. And it seems that in that way we could, I mean, at least postulate a discussion between Watsuji and Dogen in that respect. And I think that resonates with what Anna mentioned before. She says, our ways of life should show a strong ecological commitment. I would like to see if we could comment a bit more on that.
Well, I would like to start from something that Kyle said that I think is very interesting, is the idea of flourishing. That is, for example, a very important idea in the ancient Greek ethics. And for example, now Martin Nussbaum is a referent on the topic. And I think in Watsuji is something so radical and revolutionary because this flourishing is connected with nature, with environment. And of course, in the ancient Greek ethics is centered in the self, and they highlight some elements with how you should behave with others. And for example, Marco Aurelio, Epictetus, they mention even a compassive attitude to the animals. But here is different because and for me, so original and so beautiful, the idea that you have these duties because you are in the world and you are part of it. So you cannot ruin the place you inhabited, and because it's another part of you. Of course, now we have a lot of challenges because, of course, there are so many economic necessities, and people they feel in their experience that is nature against them or them against nature. So I think that the first thing to do, and I like something Kyle mentioned at the beginning, how we can do things that can be more representative to transform our experience. And I think here is a very interesting idea because you start from your own experience. Nobody who lives near to a dump or near to a mine can say that is a nice place to live. They do that because they need to, but it's not the way we think is a dignity to live in. So I think that concept here is so powerful because I think it's very original, different in other philosophies. So I think it's a powerful way to motivate us to do some different things and to change. And I would like to Kyle, he mentioned about the ethics of the authenticity, and I would like to hear more about the challenges he thinks we have to be more authentic and more authentic in our contemporary era. And also I would like to hear Carlos about something that I read, but you tell us more better about Dogen. Dogen invite us to transform our experience, right? But at the same time, there is some kind of attitude to accept that things in nature has a place, and some critics points that could represent some kind of acceptance of negative things like pollution or deteriorating of the environment. So how you can change that passive attitude attributed to Dogen. So I would like to hear more about that.
Okay, I don't know. Well, I would like first to, well, later on, of course, I would like to ask you to share that reference, because of course, well, something I need to know. But well, so I think that type of criticism can be stated in this way. It's like from Dogen and from many Mahayana Buddhist thinkers, we have I mean, the main viewpoint, the true viewpoint, is the viewpoint of non-discrimination. Good and bad, just and unjust are not essential to reality, but reality goes beyond those distinctions. And so that seems to imply that everything is the same, and we would have no reason to fight for justice, for example, or in this case, to strive for environmental equilibrium. And I think that would be the case if we forget that non-discrimination does not erase justice. I mean, it's not that justice, I mean, there is, for example, no ultimate form of justice. There is no ultimate form of the good. But that doesn't mean that good or justice do not exist. In a Mahayana mindset, actually, it would be like this. It is, there is no justice, and that's why there is justice. It's just that justice does not have a definite form that we can grasp with our intellect. Actually, justice is justice in context. It depends on conditions. The good is the good in terms of conditions. So it has no definite form. But that does not mean that the good doesn't exist. And it is actually because it does not have a definite shape that it exists. If things had a definite shape, the world would be entirely frozen. The whole of the universe would be entirely frozen. So that's the thing. Many Buddhist thinkers, I think the Buddha himself reminds us that what is a remedy or a medicine for someone can be someone else's poison. It can even be the case that what is my medicine right now could be a poison for me in another instance, in another situation. So the thing is, yeah, there is justice, there is good, but we need to discern that in context, in a concrete situation. And I think that's the way that this logic of interdependence translates into concrete situations. And in this respect, of course, we are aware, and it's a reality, that if we have pollution, if there is pollution, that's a problem for us. If there is environmental destruction, that's a problem for us. We can't deny it. Now, the thing is, we are not going to ignore that. We are not going to say that ultimately does not exist. It exists, but it exists according to conditions. And so what we do from there is that we understand the conditions in the present concretely, and we act from that viewpoint. And I think that's the way it could be approached. So the interesting thing for me is that precisely Dogen actually, I think, well, I there is more than, I don't remember the names right now, but some commentators have observed that actually Dogen's philosophy is a philosophy of action. So it's all the time he is urging us to act. He discusses, for example, in his main work, the Shobo Genzo, he discusses very complex issues that seem to relate to the structure of reality, the nature of truth, the nature of the teaching as well. But in the long run, he always goes back to that. We always goes back to the concrete present to remind us that he is not discussing things that have to do with long realities at a long distance, but he is discussing our present reality here and now. And I think that we should then always discuss and think about Dogen's philosophy in that way, the way he is calling us to action. And so that's why I think works like the instructions for the cook or the Fukushu Hampo are interesting, because that show more strikingly, more clearly, that philosophy, that Dogen's thought has to do with that, with how to act concretely given certain conditions. And I think it's exemplified in what I read today. How do I manifest the truth? How do I manifest the Dharma? How do I manifest the teaching? In the act of eating, in the act of cooking, and also in other things like cleaning or anything, even sleeping. I don't know if Kyle would like to add anything else, or...
So I'll just respond to Anna's question as well about the ethics of authenticity. So in the final chapter of my monograph, I looked at the practicality of living authentically and sort of problems which one would be faced with in sort of contemporary society. So there are two main issues which I discussed. Firstly, commodification, and secondly, social media. I'll begin with the latter first, because it's not as appropriate for Watsuji. But we'll see, it might come back. But so firstly, in modern society, a lot more of our interactions are taking place online through the medium of social media. And what we find is that websites like Facebook or Instagram, they seem to be ideal platforms for self-expression, to present who we are, because we can really tailor a particular image of ourselves. But through reading psychological studies of the internet and social media, what I discovered was that ultimately we're shaped by other people. So there's Sherry Turkle wrote a number of books, and in one of them she has a case study of a teenage girl, and the teenage girl posts like some flirty comments, and she gets loads of likes and love and lots of comments. So it makes her feel good. But then she posts something ironic or witty and doesn't get as many likes. So she begins to downplay those aspects of herself and create a certain caricature. So although the internet seems to be a good place to develop who we are, it ultimately turns out to be a virtual panopticon in sort of the Bentham or Foucault's concept, where we regulate our behavior based off other people kind of observing us and their reactions. So that's one concern for living authentically. So the other then is the issue of commodification. It's because authenticity seems to be in vogue at the moment, and not only in terms of ethics, but there's a notion of hyper-individuality. And of course, whatever is popular makes money. So companies have tried to capitalize upon this, and things that and get like tailor-made clothes. You go on the Nike's website, for example, and you can customize your trainers to your own design. But we also find that the issue with authenticity is that because it's an individualistic thing, in Western philosophy, that once you try to commodify it and then replicate it, it ceases to be authentic. And this ultimately grows to a distrust with especially people. So for example, in the workplace, how can you tell if someone is authentically your friend, or they're just using you to move up the social ladder? And again, we can think of I don't know, musicians. So maybe we really like one particular pop star's outlook or viewpoint, and we think yeah, that just really resonates with me. Like, I don't know, they just speak to my heart. But then you find out that that's not who they are. It's that they have a very savvy media group who determined that the particular demographic within which you fall spends the most money on music. They like these particular themes, so they've written the lyrics for them to present a particular image. So then upon discovering such things, we think like, oh, like how can I trust sort of like other people, whether they are being authentic or they're just trying to trick me to make money, for example. So to come back to Watsuji then, we can think that in terms of environmental issues, so again, with environmental ethics and animal testing, again, are sort of hot issues, and consumers are sort of choosing not to buy like products which test on animals, or companies which, for example, are engaging in deforestation in sort of the rainforests. So that's kind of shaping the consumer landscape in a regard. But again, how can we trust that these companies are actually genuinely concerned with the environment, or they're just doing it because they realize like we're not going to sell our products unless we're showing that we're environmentally friendly? So in terms of authenticity in relation to the environment, and if we're to apply it to Watsuji, so that could be a grave concern about a commodification. So I also have a question for yourself as well, Anna. And he said that Watsuji can help, you're suggesting that Watsuji can help explain why sort of this pandemic occurred in terms of our relationship to the environment, and so the application or understanding of the concept of Fudo. But do you think that he can also help us resolve it? So he's provided a description, but can he also provide a prescription? So one sort of a thought that I had was that for Watsuji, because human relationships are kind of central, and that's where we begin, but sort of the current pandemic has very much challenged that. So we don't have the same interactions as we used to do. And again, that's why I suggested the question of social media might come back, is that now, again, so people aren't meeting together for academic conferences, for example, but we're doing it virtually. So with Watsuji's theory kind of being based in human relations and the pandemic altering that, how would you imagine, or do you think that he can still provide a means to overcome this issue from within? Sorry, I kind of launched that upon you there.
No, I was thinking that maybe it was a bold affirmation from my part, but I'm going to try to maintain it. I'm not going to take him back, but I'm going to try to explain how. Of course, since the time he wrote, a lot of things have happened, but I think there is something that unfortunately is happen and happens now, is the way we are continue to press nature to the very, very hardest limit. And actually there are a lot of concerning numbers about deforestation, the melting of the glaciers. So it's a very sad situation. And it's not a full picture, but the point is to say, in the way the humans continue to invade nature limits, we are going to find a lot of things that is going to be hard for us to handle. For example, viruses, a lot of viruses. And there is also a lot of communities that maybe they have been sick, but we don't know because we don't have nothing to trace the sickness there. So I think this idea in Fudo, how Watsuji explains how we are shaped by the environment, it could be helpful here to notice that, of course, there is no magic solution for everyone, because, of course, the earth environment is so diverse, and we are going to need different approaches. But I think that this idea that we are embedded in the space is a key idea, because, for example, in Colombia now we are discussing if we should try it in some parts, the Amazonic territory, to communicate in different ways, not the roads, because the roads are deforestation. And behind that, there are a lot of dark interest, because if you burn the forest, a lot of landowners show up claiming that land to put soy or palm oil tree, and the communities there, they are without their ancestral territory, and they have to figure out to live in new ways that are poorer than before. And there is cultural laws, biodiversity losses, and I think this idea that food is an equilibrium of cultural aspect, historical aspect that inhabits the territory, I think is a powerful idea. So, of course, we are going to need to speak with ecologists, biologists, because they are going to tell us what is better depending on the territory we are. But for example, in Colombia right now, is terrifying the numbers of deforestation. They are up, and there is nothing that is telling now that is going to down the numbers. So it's urgent, because we are starting to see the consequences in a few years, almost with the glacier. So, digamos, I think there is a way in which we can find a prescription, but I know it's a bold affirmation. So I promise I will try to find some ecologists to help us to to apply before better.
I think one of the problems that we can, raise from Dogen or from Watsuji is that, it's understandable that people want tips. It's like, if we are discussing environmental problems, I think many people today are aware of the situation, and people want to chip in. They want to make their contribution. And so people will ask, well, what can we concretely do? Give me tips. And that's a good thing, of course. We need to, it's good to provide tips. But at the same time, from Dogen or from Watsuji as well, I think we can raise a problem. The problem is, it's not enough to have ecological tips. It will not be enough if we don't change our mindset, because our mindset is the root of the problem. I can be environmentally friendly, I can be environmentally aware, but I need to change my consumerist mindset. I need to change habits, and that's the hard thing. That changing my mindset will imply that I have to revise my habits. And I think Dogen is particularly interested in that respect. I would even say that in Soto Zen practice, you find concrete things that could be applied in those terms. It's not just, and many people know this today, it's not just knowing some tips to be more environmentally friendly. It is how to practice changing my habits in a more environmentally friendly way, in a more environmentally responsible way. And we see it in the case of Dogen. We see it in instructions about how to deal with food, precisely because food must be treated with respect. Then we cannot just say, okay, we cooked, we ate, and that we're going to leave some of the food because I don't want more food. If you have a certain amount of food served to you, then you have to eat it. If after the food is over, after the meal is over, of course there is some waste in the kitchen. What are we going to do with that waste? There are rules about that. That might depend on each monastery, but in the long run, the mindset is the same. That is, if even the tiniest grain of rice manifests the truth, then we shouldn't. If we produce waste, we should not treat it as waste. We need to think, what are we going to do with this? We do not just throw it away. We try to come up with ways of using it. So that's an inspiring thing. And from that viewpoint, I think that we could insist on that. We What we need is not just concrete ways of, what we need is not just tips. We need to change our habits, to have a practice, to practice changing our habits, so that finally the second interesting thing is that, well, even though I said that having some tips or environmental tips would not be enough if we don't change our mindset, if those tips helps us to change our habits, that could be a great starting point, as long as we are aware that the need is as big as that. We need to change our mindset. And that is not just a matter of how we think about the world or ourselves. It is about how we act. Intervening in the way we act in the world, the way when we consume resources, we are starting to do something.
Yeah, so I was kind of thinking, talking about sort of the issue of sort of the tips and like what we have to do. And I mean, there's definitely a divergence between sort of academics and activists. And I recall a colleague telling me at sort of Queen's a couple of years back, they tried to do a philosophy for everybody, sort of conference on ethics, and there's a lot of sort of activists there, and sort of the philosophers are, of course, sort of diverging sort of these abstract theories, and asked us like, but what do we do? And we're like, well, that's not what we're here to answer. We're trying to determine what sort of are the key issues to engage with. But in terms of sort of individual responsibilities, and again, reminded of, there's a British comedian called Sean Locke, and he was talking about sort of the environment and how he tries to do his bit for it. So he's getting jam jars and he's washing them, scrubbing them, trying to make sure they're really clean. He's like, meanwhile, in America, there's a massive oil spill in the sea and they're using seal pups to clean them up. And I think part of the issue is that the problem is reflected upon the individual, that as individuals, we're told we need to take responsibility when the majority of the people who are causing the issues are big corporate businesses. So I think until sort of governments begin to recognize this and sort of actually take sort of these big corporate businesses to task and ensure that they are sort of working to standards, that the individual effort isn't going to be enough. Of course, that doesn't mean that we should stop doing anything. We should still do our part, but in the grand scheme of things, unless sort of large companies are ensuring that they're not creating sort of further issues and that they are, made responsible when they do so, then environmental issues aren't going to change.
I think it comes back to that. It's I recognize that the big problem here is, what should we do? It's not just how should we think, but what should we do as well. But I think that Dogen is interestingly powerful in that respect, because for him, that's a very important question from the very start. What should we do? In all respects in life. And it's not just something that we can delegate to someone else. We need to solve that question at every step that we take in our lives. Pardon, I think Anna wants to mention something.
I just want to add something that like I say that is true, because when we buy things, we suspect maybe the companies that are selling us those commodities or things, they are not worried because for the environment. But anyway, is a stimulus to try to buy it more in a more responsible way. And there are so many fronts. That's part of the issue, because you have a responsibility as a citizen, but you can also ask to the people who represent you in the Congress, for example, to do more things with the law, for example, and all the time, every day is a little battle, because, for example, at home, how you separate the things you are going to throw to the garbage, for example. That is a simple thing that it's important to do it every time in the right way. So it's important not to give up and every day to give a little battle. I think we are going close to the end. I don't know if maybe in the chat we have some questions, but in the
Yes.
meanwhile, I would like to thank especially to Kyle to join us today. It was very interesting, this conversation, and of course we are going to be reading his book. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you. It was a pleasure to have you here. Now, well, it seems that of course I hope that we have other occasions to discuss further, because we are just like raising up the questions. Of course, discussing that is something that takes longer. But well, we need to address some comments and questions by the audience. We have one by Professor Maldonado. She made a remark in Spanish. She first said, "I like the relational role of the earth as a ground, and that the relational ceases to be a dialectical or abstract principle." And she mentioned that it was a comment to Kyle's intervention. Also, she recently added something else. She said that a concrete advice that we could take is eating seasonal produce. Well, I think it's interesting from a relational viewpoint. It is probably easier to lose track of our relation to produce that was produced far away from our homes. So that's an interesting point. Now, there is another comment by Juan Camilo Cajigas. He is part of our team as well. He said, "It would be interesting to explore the dichotomy between mind and matter in relation to what we have discussed." And, well, there is one more thing, but he added something else to that. He says, "It would be interesting to develop what some authors called mesology, that is, I guess, the science of milieu, the science of the environment. Frudo might be a way to understand non-equilibrium states." And he says, "I agree, but I don't know exactly at which point what he exactly agreed with. What would be that would be a transcultural approach to the ethical political." And there is one more comment, but if you'd like to have a word on this before, well, feel free. Because, well, one of Kyle, please.
Sorry. Yeah, so I did initially address Professor Maldonado's comment in suggesting that if it ceases to be a dialectic, we can be moving from sort of the two individuals to the family, to the community, to the state, and to the earth. I was thinking as well with, so in environmental ethics, sort of the main approach is ecocentrism as opposed to anthropocentrism. And so we just focus on sort of the earth, our earth. But recently we've sort of, again, developments in sort of space technology and emphasis upon sort of other worlds and looking for other like suitable habitats. So perhaps we could also apply or extend sort of Watsuji's theory from the earth to the universe. So if, per se, we do trash the earth and everybody who can afford to do so leaves and goes to a better planet, so what's to prevent them doing the same thing again? So thinking about sort of how we'd form relationships to our world, anything, and then again we could sort of expand that or apply that further. So in that sense, it would still be a dialectic in terms of the earth, but it seems that it would cease at sort of the universe unless we discover something larger than sort of the cosmos. And like, yes, I also agree, like seasonal vegetables. And of course, so I'm originally from the UK in Northern Ireland. And of course, like Brexit has affected us greatly. And one of the main concerns is that the prices and everything is just going to go up, because if there's no special connection to the EU anymore, a lot of vegetables like oranges, carrots, like came from Spain. So again, perhaps there may be like a positive outcome after all, that maybe people will focus on sort of smaller scale industry and local farms and sort of buying from wherever is popular. And another sort of contemporary phenomenon is, I'm not sure if you're aware, something called a hipster. So
everywhere now.
But so the hipsters, although we like to sort of ironically mock them for their conformity to non-conformism. So they like to be different and do things differently, but we all have a stereotype of them dressing a certain way, riding fixed gear bicycles, using typewriters instead of computers. But there's also been a hipster demand for more individual or unique produce as well. And this has also led to small-scale farming. So going to kind of exclusive restaurants and which have their vegetables delivered fresh from a local market or a local farmer. So we can see these kind of things taking place as well. And then, so going back to the issue of like commodification, like there is a demand for it. So yeah, we can see that people are readily engaging in perhaps not necessarily seasonal vegetables, but at least local. And of course, that then cuts down on the cost of sort of transportation and again, sort of the mass production of it, because I suppose they would anticipate that on the journey, some of the fruit or vegetables will spoil and go bad. So they have to have a larger quantity then to ensure that they're going to have a sufficient amount. So again, buying locally is going to sort of reduce that feature.
Indeed. Well, actually, some practices, like some people are building like home farms or home. They have their orchards or something like that at home, and that would be interesting from the viewpoint that, I mean, if you have to grow your own vegetables, then you have a stronger connection to that. You put effort on that, so you know that you don't have to. I mean, if you put that on your plate, you are more prone to not wasting that because it was your own work. Jose Luis Hernandez has a remark and a question. He is talking about haiku, interestingly. He says, I think one of the great grounds of Oriental philosophy is the Japanese one with its haikus. They are a poetic yet pictographic way of pointing out the simplicity of praxis. Haikus are a great way to show the harmony between society and nature, way different from a Hegelian philosophy. Oh, sorry, that was another thing. Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's, well, interestingly, Dogen, for example, inspires haiku artists, haiku writers in later centuries. And Dogen himself was a poet. Interestingly, he had very harsh remarks against the exercise of poetry. He told his disciples to go away from poetics and because it would a non-Buddhist texts, he says, because that would be a waste of time. But probably his criticism was against simply divertisement, against just delighting in aesthetic pleasure without a strong connection to things. But the truth is that he made poetry in Chinese style mainly, but also in Japanese styles. He wrote in the waka style. And that was important, I think, in the development of haiku. And it's an interesting way to show concretely how what he says in a way that would sound more abstract to us. But he in poetry, this can be shown in a concrete and even in an aesthetically concrete way. And a haiku is powerful in that respect. It shows, it pushes us to observe the connection between the environment and ourselves. And from that viewpoint, to see how the environment I mean, the development of subjectivity is not something that we perform by like splitting ourselves, by distinguishing clearly ourselves from the environment. No, actually, the environment, the roses, the cherry trees, the water, the grass, the mountains, the valleys, the sky, actually are an opportunity for us to discover what we ourselves are. Because those things are actually not just showing us what we are, but in this moment constituting what we are. So I would see it in that respect. But now Jose Luis, and I think we could finish here, observe something else. He says, what do you think about the relation between Hegel and Haiku? I don't know how to approach that, but if you have any remark on that. I think he refers especially to dialectics. Probably there's a dialectics in Haiku that we wouldn't see in Hegel, or that it's different from Hegel in a certain respect.
I know about Hegel, but I don't know enough about haikus to comment, unfortunately. Sorry.
Well, probably the question was going in that direction, but well, at the same time, probably. Well, it's interesting that there's a place where that can be discussed, and that's Nishitani, especially Nishitani, because he is firmly, well, as he belongs to the Kyoto school, he is firmly grounded on Hegel's philosophy, not only, but the influence of Hegel is very important in the school. But at the same time, he quotes haikus and other Japanese poets. And so I think we could ask that question to Nishitani sensei. I mean, we should read Nishitani on that respect. And probably what Nishitani would say, among other things, is that what happens, well, the problem, I mean, he goes with Hegel's dialectic, but only to the point that, yes, Hegel recognizes the need to, I mean, to see the negativity between extremes in a more positive light. I mean, contradiction does not need to be bad. It is an opportunity for further development, for further dialectical development. But at the same time, Hegel goes in the direction of an ultimate, I mean, his goal is an ultimate unification of reality in terms of that dialectic, which would be equivalent to the equation of thought and being. Nishitani would claim, well, but that erases negativity. You start recognizing negativity, acknowledging negativity, but then you erase it from the picture. And that does not happen in haiku. And actually we could read haiku with that key. In haiku, we could recognize, yes, there is a dialectic between me and the environment, and I don't appear in the haiku, but in the way that I observe the environment, I appear. And still, I am who I am, and the environment is what it is. Watsuji, I think, recognizes this more clearly than Hegel, when he says, I think, that the structure of existence, of human existence, is negative. It is a dialectic between the individual and the collective. And the collective needs the individual, but at the same time, the individual needs a collective, even though they negate each other. And that negative tension is never over. You cannot erase that tension. If you do that, you erase the terms. Probably that's, I hope that helps a bit.
Yeah, I see that Jose pointed out that, or he wanted to suggest the difference about the approach to the relation of nature in Hegel and Haiku. So yeah, I think you're sort of suggesting that for the Kyoto school, for Watsuji, it's all about sort of like nothing, whereas for Hegel, it's about being. So in the science of logic, for example, so he wants to begin with indeterminate being. So like being, or the concept of being without any concept, and then of course the dialectic moves because when you're thinking about being, you're thinking about nothing because there's no that being is, and then of course you're thinking about something and keeps going back and forth. And for Hegel, it's ultimately to arrive at sort of this absolute spirit. Yes, I suppose if we think about sort of Basho's, the famous the frog like jumping into the pond and making the splash. Yeah, and I suppose like he's trying to create that connection of interdependent arising, perhaps, and sort of suggested when we see in like Nishitani and Watsuji, and this connection between sort of humans and their environment. So it's of the frog jumping in, it's on the splash, it's kind of almost as though you are the frog sort of jumping in and splashing rather than just sitting back and observing an objective thing or sentient animal, for example, jumping in. And then, so when we think about like a Thomas Nagel and his approach, like what is a bat? So rather than trying to like think about what's the conscious state or what's sort of happening inside the bat, and I think it's or rather than looking at their being as a Hegelian would do, from a Kyoto school approach, it's sort of understanding that connection from its own standpoint, from our interdependence.
Mm-hmm. And if we want to understand that, it's not only about how we intellectually understand it, but how we act on it. Which is, I think that point is we need to it's never stressed enough, probably.
Mm.
Well, once again, I would like to thank you very much for this talk. I think, well, probably there's a lot more to think about, but that's the objective as well. And I would also like to thank our audience for following us and for their helping remarks here. I hope that inspired you to continue reflecting on these issues. I'm surely very inspired. So once again, I can't thank you enough. Thank you very much. And I'll see you again we'll have other chances, of course. Thank you very much. Have a good night, Colombia. Have a good morning, Japan. Right.